This is American TV with Mitchell Hadley. We just finished recording a show on American television producer Quinn Martin, and now we're going to turn our eyes and ears to a guy who was not a commercial success necessarily in television, but who probably or maybe even has a more outsized influence on television even down to today. And that is Fred Mr. Rogers of public television fame. So let me, before we do, let me just introduce Mitch again. And for those who have not seen any of our other shows, Mitch, if you can give a little background about yourself.
Sure. Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me back. I write about classic television at the blog itsabouttv.com, which you can see over my shoulder there. I have written 3 books, including The Electronic Mirror, which talks about classic television and what it says about our past and our future. And my upcoming book is, which I hope will be out before the end of the year, is called The Descent into Hell. It's a look at classic television's prophecy of today's brave new world. And today we're going to be talking about somebody who made that brave new world just a little easier to live in.
Well, it's interesting. Just as I flipped to a couple of pages, including the Wikipedia page, 2 things jumped out at me, even just from the first paragraph on Wikipedia. The first is that Mr. Rogers has been dead for over 20 years. I would have sworn it was only 10 or 12 years. It's one of those things.
I was astounded by that myself.
And the second one is that his middle name was McFeely, because there was a character on his show called Mr. McFeely.
Mr. McFeely, yes.
I had no idea that was anything but just an invention. But so his name was Fred, not Frederick, just Fred McFeely Rogers. And when one thinks of the creation of public television, there really are just 2 programs that seem to stand out from the beginning of that. The one, obviously, is Sesame Street, which is even more famous than Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and then, of course, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I've always found it interesting that, yes, Sesame Street has gone on, and now it's even off PBS. Mr. Rogers' show obviously died with him. But unlike Sesame Street, the whole host of characters played by humans and puppets, I don't think there was any merchandising, whereas Sesame Street became a bonanza for cashing in. And that's not a slight against Jim Henson, who created Sesame Street and all of the Muppets and stuff. But I think it bespeaks well of Rogers' character. So let me ask you if we can, let's talk a little bit about the man, because he's one of these revered figures, and he doesn't have, even as far as I know, a whiff of scandal about him. So what is, if you want to take up on that?
Mm-hmm. Well, Fred Rogers, born in 1928, died in 2003. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister. His specific vocation in the ministry was to minister to children through the medium of television. So he looked at television as part of his overall ministry, as in fact his specific ministry. He first got into television with the educational station in Pittsburgh, WQED, that's his hometown, and he started there in 1953. And the first show that he worked on was a show called The Children's Corner. And that debuted in the following year in 1954. And it ran for a couple of seasons, the second season of which was picked up and shown on NBC on Saturday mornings. And at that point, you could already see the creation of some of the characters that people would come to know and love on Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. You had Daniel Striped Tiger, you had King Friday the 13th. These puppet characters were already part of Fred Rogers' way of relating to kids, and that predates what we've come to see as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood by a good decade. He goes up to Canada to work for the CBC with a show that was called Mr. Rogers, all one word, Misterogers. And that's a 15-minute version of what we would come to think of as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, although it doesn't really have the human elements. It's pretty much just set in the land of make-believe. When that show expands and becomes part of the Eastern Educational Television Network in 1966, it's reframed as Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It's still all one word, Mr. Rogers, but it's now Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And he is a resident of that neighborhood. A slight distinction, but you're starting to see the intrusion of Fred Rogers, the human being, with the land of make-believe. As I say, that is seen in Pittsburgh and in some other parts of the country, specifically on the East, because we don't really have a national education television network as such. You have NET, which is starting to be put together, but it's not what PBS would later become, an organized set of stations all showing programs at the same time. So Rogers is a regional TV figure at that point. In 1968, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood becomes nationally shown on NET. And it's still broadcast out of Pittsburgh, but at this point the show becomes very much what you would go on to see for the next 30-some years. It grows, evolves, changes over time, but a lot of the pieces were already there, and now they're coming into play. And you see everything with the cardigan sweater and the tennis shoes, where he changes out of his sport coat and dress shoes, and the gentle nature that he assumes when he's working with children. All of that is there, and it's a very interesting evolution, because he's kind of, in a way, the anti-Sesame Street. And I want to say that he was competing with Sesame Street, that he was against Sesame Street. It was more like a complementary relationship, because Sesame Street was involved in educating children, trying to give them language skills, mathematical skills, different things like that. Fred Rogers was interested in the child, in helping the child grow up in a scary world, and in helping the child to have some sense of his or her importance in the world. So he wasn't out to educate them. He was going in a different direction. That's why I say that it was kind of the anti-Sesame Street. The tone of the show was actually a little bit like Captain Kangaroo, although which was a long-running CBS show for children. Now, Captain Kangaroo had some pretty wild elements. It had cartoons, which Mr. Rogers didn't have. It had, scenes that we would consider high energy, where the captain is having ping pong balls dropped on him and all these different kinds of things. And you wouldn't have anything that wild on Mr. Rogers, but there was the gentleness and the softness, and showing children about things like the farm and animals, and introducing them to the world around them. I think that that's the kind of thing that he wanted to do, wanted to help them to feel more comfortable in a world that he saw as becoming increasingly dangerous, increasingly hostile, increasingly difficult for a child to grow up in.
Yeah, one of the things that sticks out in my mind about Mr. Rogers versus similar shows of the era, whether it's Captain Kangaroo, later on Wonderama, which was going around, is that the only other show that I can think of other than Mr. Rogers, where he would look in the camera and actually talk to kid is Romper Room, who would do a similar thing to
Yes.
Romper Room shows where they would look at it. I see Mary, I see Bobby, I see Billy Joe, kind of thing. Um, but unlike Romper Room, the Romper Room was more about just having fun. It would sometimes have an interracial cast of kids from the studio audience and whatnot. But Mr. Rogers specifically, I think, was going for what would now be considered the soft social science approach,
Yep.
rather than Sesame Street, which would be, today's show is sponsored by the number 7 or the letter Q or whatever it was, and just do things on that. Rogers was more or less more interested in the emotional rather than the educative value.
Yes, yes, the emotional and therefore the psychological health of the child. Now, one of the first shows that he did that emphasizes something like this came very early on in his run on PBS, NET. It comes in April of 1968 with June of 1968, the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy. And he went to and received from NET a prime time half hour to do a show. He'd never, this was unheard of for a children's show to be broadcast in prime time like this. It was put together with 2 days' notice. And it was a show that was in prime time because it was geared not toward the children, but toward the adults. And he opens the show because if you can look back at 1968 for a moment, and I just want to digress for a minute into that because it's important to put the show into some kind of context. In April of 1968, the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. You had racial strife throughout the country. You had riots going on. You had the Vietnam War being conducted, and you had riots going on over that. You had this sense of a growing divide in the country in every respect. There was a divide politically. There was a divide between the generations, the generation gap. You had hippies, you had free love, you had drugs. You had all these things that were happening more or less at the same time. And in the midst of this, in June of 68, Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of the assassinated President John F. Kennedy, who was running for president, was assassinated in California following his victory in the California primary. And one of the things that Rogers noted about that was that it was possibly the first time for many of these children, who we're talking about children, 4, 5, 6 years old, it's possibly the first time in their lives that they have ever seen their parents upset, crying, worried about something, unless there had been a particular tragedy in the family. This was maybe the first time they were seeing that. And Rogers comes on during this primetime special, and he has this one sentence that I wrote down here because I think it sums him up as well as anything else. He says, "I've been terribly concerned about the graphic display of violence which the mass media has been showing recently." That would have included the violent scenes at the hotel where Kennedy was assassinated, when you didn't actually see him shot, but you saw the blood, you saw him lying on the floor, all these kinds of things. I've been terribly concerned about the graphic display of violence which the mass media has been showing recently, and I plead for your protection and support of your young children. There is just so much that a very young child can take without it being overwhelming. And so he spent the half hour partly talking to children. There's a memorable moment when Daniel Striped Tiger asks the question, "What does assassination mean?" Asks it seemingly out of nowhere, which was meant to remind parents that their children often hear things that they may not be aware of, and that they often know a great deal more about what's going on than people think they do. And so he wanted to address that. He wanted to talk about various ways that you share with your children your grief, and that children may process grief in different ways, that here are some ways in which you as a family can go through this type of thing. It was a profoundly human type of a story that he was telling in making this presentation about how to help your children through these difficult times. And oh, by the way, I think a lot of you are going to find this helpful too. Now, he does a similar show to this in 2001 after I think the final run of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood had ended. He comes back after September 11th and does a similar show helping adults understand how to help their children deal with the effects of what had happened on 9/11. And ever since then, every time there has been some kind of a national disaster or a national crisis of some type, invariably people will talk about the need, the wish, the desire that there was a Fred Rogers who could come on and calm people down and minister to children in a way that he did with those specials. They may even rerun the 9/11 special occasionally for something like that, because the message is timeless, even if the context is specific.
Yeah.
And I think that's where you see Fred Rogers really coming to the fore as the Mr. Rogers that we will know.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is throughout the run from the late 60s through the 80s, you had several popes come and go. You had the televangelist scandals of the 80s. You had the rise of television, where people would, have ministries online, and yet on television rather. And yet the thing that strikes me about Mr. Rogers is, even someone like me who is agnostic and atheist, he even though he was a Christian denomination, there's almost this feeling that he's a secular saint, because he would have, and I think, and I could be wrong, but I think I remember even in my childhood in the early 70s, some shows dealing with different religions. I certainly remember Jews and Roman Catholics, although Roman Catholics are Christian, but a different denomination.
Yeah.
And I don't know, he may have done some on Islam or Hinduism or something, where he has this sort of, I guess you'd call it, he was actually more of a pantheist, in the sense that he felt that there was something common to all religions, that had quality and that people could learn from, and that just because your religion was different, and he may have even done something on people who were agnostics, there was this sense that he was the great link between different belief systems.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up, because this was something that I wanted to touch on if we had time. You see, Fred Rogers, I think, was a man who was in some ways misunderstood on both sides of the ideological spectrum. And that's usually a pretty good thing, when both the left and the right misunderstand parts of you. But there's a popular meme going around on online nowadays in social media about how Rogers was a minister, and yet in all the time he did the show, he never mentions the word God. That's true. But that is, I think, an incomplete representation of his view about religion. As a minister, he understood very well the meaning of living one's faith, that faith without works was incomplete. His particular ministry, as we said, was working with children through the medium of television. He would have known about the teachings of someone like Dietrich Bonhoeffer talking about cheap grace, for example. He would have known about St. Francis talking about how all of nature itself breathes the existence of God. I'm paraphrasing something there. He may have never said anything like that. But the point is that Francis saw God in everything, and so did Fred Rogers. And I think that to say that he never used the word God is a misrepresentation, because it was present in everything that he did. You know, Korzybski had a famous saying once about the map is not the territory. It has a similar structure to the territory. And this is the same kind of thing. When he's talking about, the word is not the God. It is self-evident in the existence of his creation. And so that's why I think he never specifically talked about about God in a theological sense, because it was overwhelmingly present in everything that he discussed. So I think the meme that you see on Facebook or Twitter is completely misunderstanding how he handled things. Now, to your point, you are correct that he never became denominational in what he was talking about. What was important to him was a broad concept of tolerance and of appreciating differences. I don't know that he ever wanted to suggest that there were no differences, that everything was the same or that everything was equal, but he wanted people to be able to appreciate those differences as being different, but equally dignified with humanity, rather than becoming a stigma. And so when he would bring on people who lived essentially in motorized wheelchairs, or who suffered from some other kind of a disability, or who were from different races, different creeds, he was doing that to demonstrate that they were different, but that wasn't important. What was important was the humanity of the individual. The differences were very real, but and there was an example when he had had someone on who was one of the characters in the show who was black, and they soaked their feet together in a tub of water.
I remember that one.
A tremendously human moment, and it would have had no meaning if there wasn't clearly the fact that the two were different. So that for him to be successful in what he was talking about, what you had to do was acknowledge the differences, but understand that the differences were not essential to what was important, which was the deep humanity and respect for individuality that must be inside every person to be able to get along. That is, I think, the message that he wanted to impart to people. And I think if I can continue on that for just a moment longer, because this would be a good time to bring it up. I mentioned that he was misunderstood by both the left and the right. I think this is an example of how the left misunderstood him, but I think that there were those on the right who misunderstood him as well, when they would say that he was pioneering the idea of participation medals, or the idea that I'm okay, you're okay, all these kinds of things. Well, that's not true either. And again, you go back to the man is a minister. He knows the Bible. He knows that he knows St. Paul discussing the importance of running the race and running to win. Those would have been built into his understanding of Christianity. And so when he's talking to children about the important things, maybe not winning, but competing, well, that's nothing more than an echo of St. Paul himself, that if it is important to do, it is important to do well, but it's also important to do badly, because it is important to do. And so what he saw in these was that there was an inherent dignity to the act itself. If you are competing in some way, and you are, if you were like me, when I was growing up, I was hopelessly out of shape. Now I'm only out of shape, not so hopelessly, but I'm still there. But I wasn't going to win any foot races. I wasn't going to accomplish any great feats of athleticism, some minor ones, but not great ones. But the larger point is that I was never going to win a race. And he wasn't going to give me a participation trophy for just having been out there. What he was going to say was that the important thing was that it was important to run the race. It was important to make the effort. It was important to do the best job you could do because it infused all of those actions with an innate sense of dignity that only comes from the human individual, which again in turn only comes from the creation and the creator. And that is a deeply religious message without bringing religion into it at all. There's another quote from one of the saints I think about. They say that where he says, you must preach the gospel at every opportunity. When necessary, use words. And that's the point. He was able to do it through action. He was able to do it through example. Whenever he brought these people on the show, he was able to help these children to understand things that they may not be hearing or getting from their parents or their schoolmates or anybody else. And that's how he was working with them.
In this segment, I want to talk a little bit about some of the myths, some of the beliefs, some of the accomplishments, in no particular order. So I just want to pick up on I seem to remember, and I could be wrong, but I think that at some point Mr. Rogers might have had one of the Apollo astronauts on.
I would be shocked if he didn't have one of them on.
Yeah, because I seem to remember one of the things that Mr. Rogers did, and I think he picked up on it from NASA, was that the moon landing was a human accomplishment, not just an American accomplishment.
Mm-hmm.
And something tell maybe it wasn't on his show. Maybe he was a guest on another show or something. But he met with either Armstrong or Buzz Aldrin or Collins or one of those three. Do you have any memory of that, or is there any record of that?
Only a vague memory that they were on there. It I don't know, for some reason it could have even been somebody like Jim Lovell, one of the earlier or later astronauts, but I would be very surprised if he didn't do something about that. And if your memory is that he was talking about how was as a human accomplishment, that would be, as opposed to either an American accomplishment, or even if you were to look at it in terms of it was a human accomplishment as opposed to a purely technical accomplishment, that would be very much keeping with everything else that he talked about.
Yeah, and I remember also too, he always seemed to be in the 70s during the Vietnam era. Now, I'm sure if he were alive, he would be dealing with Ukraine, Russia, and Gaza. Yep. Israel stuff, and in looking at some of the information, it seems that if I were to use one word to define him, it would be empathy. And this seems to come from his youth, where he was obese and mocked, yep. And he was very shy. But this had the great effect that he went inward. And probably one of the other things that sticks in my mind is he was probably the greatest champion of the imagination of the last 50 or 60 years, even more so than some great artists. So if you could talk about maybe those two aspects, empathy and imagination.
Yeah, I think you chose empathy very well. That was part of what he talked about a lot, because empathy is key to caring. And caring is the central tenet of what he believes, I think, in terms of caring for others, caring for yourself. That's how he felt, and that he did have a very difficult childhood in that sense of his feeling of self-esteem, of how other children looked at him, and only somebody, I think, who has gone through that kind of situation can develop the kind of empathy to understand the unique way that a child feels when he's picked on because he's different in some way. Again, one of the things that he stressed was that different does not mean better or worse. It means precisely what it means, different. And I think that the empathy was very strong. Listening was a word that somebody said once was very vital to him. You can't really listen, and sometimes that's all you have to do with children. He would say is to listen to what they're saying, what they're telling you. Listen to the words and listen to what they're not saying, but listen. And you can't listen unless you're quiet. You can't listen unless you are empathizing with the person that's talking to you. So those were part of his core values. And when you were talking about war, you just mentioned war in passing, but they even dealt with war in the land of make-believe. Somebody was mentioning that the neighborhood did actually sometimes come close to war in some of the conflicts that would develop, either between King Friday the 13th and some of his subjects or some of the other countries. But he always wanted to be able to show that people were able to figure it out. And again, I think that brings home something important, that he would say that you never forget to show how things actually are. You can't show how to overcome a problem unless you acknowledge that a problem exists in the first place. And so that, to avoid conflict, and to get over conflict, you acknowledge conflict. I think he understood that quite well.
Yeah, and you mentioned briefly, we might have touched upon it. There was a famous show that he did with a young boy in the late 70s, early 80s who was in a wheelchair. And then
Yes.
25 years later, or near his death, maybe a couple of years before his death, when Rogers received an Emmy or a Lifetime Emmy, or I don't know, it might have been a Lincoln Honors or something.
Yeah.
That same boy, now 35 or 40, whatever he was, came back still in a wheelchair, and they sang "Won't You Be My Neighbor," and it was a very touching moment. And I also remember, and that's a famous one, but I also seem to recall that sometime in the 70s there was another wheelchair incident, probably before the little boy, where it had a man who had been in the U.S. Army who had lost a leg or something and was in a wheelchair. Uh, do either of those? Well, I mean, the more famous one, maybe you have more information about, but those just come back to me.
Yeah, I remember the first one that you mentioned. I think he was getting some kind of a Lifetime Achievement Award or something, but it was a tremendously moving moment for an industry that can be very cynical in Hollywood when you're talking about real people. And that was always one of the things that people marveled about, was that you looked for holes to poke in with Mr. Rogers, because you couldn't possibly believe that there was anybody who was really like this. And in fact, he talked about how he had a temper. He had difficulty controlling his temper. It was something he had to work on when he was raising his children. He was not superhuman. He was not born with these individual qualities that nobody else could have. He wasn't a saint in that respect, but it was something that he had to work to overcome. Again, it's something that means he can understand. And so when he had that moment with the boy, and then I think that was the same show. It possibly was, because at the end of that show, he did something that he often did in settings like that, where he asked people to just be absolutely quiet for 1 full minute.
Mm.
And in that minute, first of all, it showed just how long a minute can be and
Yeah.
how difficult it can be to not be self-conscious. But he asked people to just take a minute and think about somebody who had played an important, very important role in their lives and where they might be tonight, and different aspects of that, but always thinking about the role that other people played in your life and understanding that you may be playing that same role in somebody else's life. And I think that's a prime example when people start looking at someone like that, and their first instinct is to say, "Is this guy for real?" And they find out that he is. And as when I mentioned about his temper and different things like that, that's just to show that he wasn't perfect, but he was still real, and it showed what anybody is capable of, and that's what the message that he wanted to impart to people. But I and that was I'm not a cynic, well, maybe a little bit, but I'm a hardened viewer of television, so I don't get emotional very often or teary-eyed when something happens. But that moment with the young man in the wheelchair that he had on the show is a very moving scene, and it certainly moved him. And I think that he was always aware of the impact he had on other people's lives without ever taking it for granted. I would imagine he must have been quite uh, moved to see the impact he'd had on that young man's life.
Um, I wonder if the thing about the temper, which his wife had mentioned after his death, I think I saw it in the documentary that was made of him about 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Hmm.
I wonder if that's responsible for the meme that Mr. Rogers was somehow, a badass killer in World War
Yeah,
II. First, he was a little too young to have made it,
yeah.
and I think it's also riffing off the fact that Bob Ross, a similarly soft-spoken PBS
Hmm.
star of the late '70s to early '90s, painting his kind of cheesy paintings, was actually a badass drill instructor.
Yes,
Um,
yes. I think there's something, that we always like to think that there is something like that in somebody's background that would really throw us. But what that mentioning that reminded me of something that I had read about him, that someone was talking about how soft spoken and how gentle he was, but also that in a way he was a very masculine man, a very positive role model for men, because he understood that um, talking about things like empathy and listening are very important, and it's very important to display those. But sometimes males become engaged by terms like courage and respect, and those are all part of empathy and listening, and that was a certain way he was able to shape his message too, and those were important qualities for him. So those are those are very masculine qualities. But in the talk of the day, where we talk about things like toxic masculinity, there was nothing of that about him. I think, though, that masculinity was a quality we don't normally think of, and yet the values that he imparts and talks about are very much embedded in that kind of being.
I was just looking up because I wondered if he had ever dealt with the subject of homosexuality on the
Hmm.
show. And I was just looking up, and apparently in 2020, People published an article. The same black man who soaked his feet apparently was gay in real life, Officer Clemens.
Uh-huh.
Apparently, though, Mr. Rogers said that it didn't bother him what he did in his private life, but he couldn't be out as gay on the show as a gay man.
Hmm.
So this was probably back in the '80s or whatever it was. So I wonder. I wonder. Do you know anything about that article, and did it provoke any kind of
I
controversies?
I don't actually. I had not heard about that before, but to the extent that he didn't want to bring it up on the show, that doesn't surprise me. It wouldn't have been the right time era to bring it up. For one thing, it would have caused more controversy than it would have been worth, and it might not have been what he would have considered the proper venue to discuss it either.
Yeah. Well, it says that it says it would have interfered with the mission of the show.
Yeah, I think that is a justifiable reaction to have, because if you are going to follow the values that Rogers displayed and advocated for on his programs, that idea of tolerance and acknowledging differences, then I think that it is going to be something that you are going to also display in a situation like that. It does not mean you are going to, and here is a reason why I think he might not have wanted to get into it, because you come into that very slippery slope, which we're still dealing with today, between condoning the act and loving the person, or the old saying about love the sinner and not the sin. And I think it would have been not only getting bogged down in polemics, but to be distracted from the core of what he was talking about, to go off in another direction. And I don't know that children especially would have been able to understand that anyway, but his core message, I think, in that sense, is that, you love people for who they are, not necessarily for what they do. But how do you explain something that complex in I don't know how he felt about any of those kinds of issues, and I think he would have felt that it would have been a very difficult thing without getting completely bogged down in something that could be distracting toward the overall message.
And it's interesting too, because he was so soft spoken, Mr. Rogers was often made fun of in popular media, like Saturday Night Live, as himself being gay.
Yes, and he rather enjoyed the Eddie Murphy portrayals of him in different ways. He found those humorous rather than mean-spirited. He thought that they were very affectionate, and from what I understand, they were. He did, on occasion, slightly bring up somebody. I think he had once said something to Johnny Carson that caused Carson to slightly alter the way in which he would portray Rogers with any humor. And so I think he was a man who was supremely confident and comfortable with himself, but he would be bothered by a portrayal if he felt that it was either mean-spirited or in some way not invoking the correct feeling. Now I don't know how he felt, if anybody ever asked him how he felt about the bit they did on SCTV when he was
with
the captain at PBS Battle of the PBS Stars. Yes, when he used King Friday the 13th to beat up Julia Child in the ring in their boxing match. But there was nothing mean about that. I think he might have even been humored by that. But,
I think I saw a retrospective about SCTV where someone, one of the actors there, said that he actually found it kind of funny. So
yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. In our earlier show when we talked about Quinn Martin and about how his shows were so stylized that it became easy to lampoon them or to make fun of them, I think the same thing exists with Fred Rogers, and I think for the most part those parodies were all done with great love and affection for him, and the people who chose to do them in ways that were not necessarily so charitable probably found out that they didn't get very much of a reception from the people who were viewing them.
So you had mentioned earlier Mr. Rogers saving public television in the late 60s. As often happens, a government program, in this case the funding of public television by the Johnson administration, a year or two later, after Nixon won the presidency, was out to cut it, claiming it was a failure, it wasn't doing its mission, this, that, or the other thing. If you want to go into that sort of brouhaha.
Yeah, I won't spend a lot of time on it because you could spend a lot of time on it, but it's important to understand a little bit about the senator who was at the heart of the hearing. Was John Pastore, who is a Democratic senator from Rhode Island, and he had been a thorn in the side of television for quite some time, not just public television, but television across the board. He was one of the crusaders going back to the 1960s against the amount of violence on television. And because of his influence in Congress and the posts that he had, the committees that he was serving on in Congress, he had a lot of clout when it came to talking about that. Networks resented Pastore. They were afraid of him as well, though. And one of the things that I was recently working on was about how the Wild Wild West, which was one of the more action-packed, violent shows of the late 1960s, was still very popular on CBS when it was canceled. But it was canceled as a sop to Pastore and some of the other anti-violence members of Congress to show that, yes, the networks were interested in trying to control the level of violence. Now, violence is a completely separate topic from what we're about to talk about, but I say that to indicate that Pastore was kind of a bugaboo for television in general, public television, network television. Now, to bring it to the case of Rogers being in front of Pastore's committee and talking about the importance of keeping public television on the air, it looks apparent from reading the transcripts and watching the video that Pastore wasn't familiar with who Fred Rogers was or what his influence was on television at the time that he was in front of the committee. Now, yes, it's true that Rogers had only been on the national NET for a year, but he had been, as I mentioned at the outset, on public educational television in the East Coast, which includes both Washington, D.C. and Rhode Island, which is where Pastore was from. So he doesn't, for a man who's involved in television as much as Pastore is, there really, I don't think, is a good excuse for why he would not have been more familiar with Rogers. Nevertheless, it appears that he wasn't. And so, coming from the standpoint of somebody who doesn't know Fred Rogers from Adam, he asks Rogers why they shouldn't cut the budget in half, down to $10 million from $20 million. And Rogers gives an edited version of his standard appeal of what his show is about, how it's important for him to be able to help children to make it through difficult times, how to not only to live within their world, but to understand what that world is made of. When you watch the speech, it's impassioned in a very low-key way, but from what we've been talking about for the last 50 minutes or so, there's nothing in the speech that would talk, actually, is probably more appropriate. Speech is a little formal, but there's nothing you would have heard Rogers say in that talk that would be any different from what we've talked about in that time period. But it struck a chord with Pastore. It moved him, and it brought home, I think, an element of what Rogers was doing that Pastore perhaps was not expecting with public television, certainly not with the kind of shows that Rogers was talking about. If Pastore was thinking of anything, it might have been Sesame Street, which was a bit more controversial. And so I think it opened up an avenue of what Rogers was talking about that Pastore wasn't familiar with or thinking about. And he is moved by it. He says so. And at the end, he says, I think you've got your 20 million. So I don't know that there was any other figure on public television, human figure, who could have delivered that kind of a message the way that Fred Rogers was able to. Um, I don't think that Jim Henson could have done it, although he might have been able to. There weren't the figures like Alistair Cook yet who were so associated with it. I don't know that anybody else could have done what he did. And so if you want to think of Rogers as the man who saved public television, I think you're entirely within your rights to do so.
So I wanted to talk about his famous introductory song because I was just looking at the lyrics, and it's only about It's only about 18 lines, but there's in virtually every line there's a you or a we. There's the addressing to the viewer, the child. I mentioned how Romper Room would have a little call out of 5 or 6 names, but the whole song, and it's sung. I believe it wasn't a stock singing. Every episode he sang the song and did something slightly different, taking off his sneakers, taking off his sweater, or putting them back on at the end of the day. What is your take on that song? Because it's very rare that you would get a song that would be directed right through the fourth wall or through the camera, and by doing so, it reminds me of the old sort of row your boat where it was participatory, even though you can't hear the children sort of singing along with him.
Yeah, I don't know that I can add much to what you've already said about it, because I think that you've really summed it up well. There's something very gentle about the lyrics. There is something very inviting to children, very non-threatening. That won't you be my neighbor? Won't you be my friend? Befriend me. Things like that. He meets children on their level, but he does not talk down to them. He respects them as individuals. He respects them as human beings. As I mentioned with the Kennedy special, he is well aware that they probably are much more aware of what's going on around them than we think they are, and so while he doesn't talk down to them, he meets them on their level. I think that's an example of it, and as you mentioned, with the repeated use of you, we, us, that kind of thing, that the whole idea, won't you be my neighbor, just so gentle and so genuine that I can't think of very many cases where you have a song that so thoroughly sums up what he's all about as that does.
Also, according to what I read online, his wife, who I think is now deceased as well, after his death, had stated that he answered every bit of mail himself, even during when the show was, through reruns, that he would sometimes be a month or a year behind, but he handled, even if it was just 1 or 2 sentences, saying
and
thank you.
If he wasn't able to answer each letter, he edited each response. So even if somebody were to write the skeleton of it or the boilerplate of it, he read every letter and he edited every letter, and so every response had a personal touch from him. Even if somebody had come up with the bones, he was the flesh.
Yeah, I want to just pick up on the word that I used some time ago, talking about imagination, and talking about the land of King Friday and Daniel the Striped Tiger and a handful of other characters. The interesting thing there was these were I guess not married. I guess they were mostly hand puppets, but King Friday's lips never moved the way Cookie Monster's did. Daniel the Tiger wasn't capable. They didn't have the technology that Sesame Street did even 50 some years ago, and yet the characters remain memorable. I remember a couple of years ago I saw apparently Daniel the Striped Tiger has a cartoon show now.
Yes. I think one of his offspring. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I would assume the Rogers estate had to sign off on that.
Yeah, it's an animated show.
So what aside from an obvious thing like that, what do you think that Fred Rogers' legacy is to this point and going on into the future?
Well, I think you've nailed a lot of it when you've talked about the importance of imagination and the importance of make believe. It reminds me, in a way, if you look back at the classic movie Miracle on 34th Street, and you see the scene where Kris Kringle is teaching Natalie Wood the power of imagination, the world of imagination that opens up an entire universe to a child. And it's very important that that imagination be cultivated. And so I think that was very, very essential to what he was talking about. At the same time, he always made sure that the children understood that the land of make-believe was just that. It was an imaginary land. And Mr. McFeely, the postman, was kind of the conduit between the real world that Fred Rogers and his guests inhabited and the make-believe world with with the puppets and with what was going on there. You had Betty Aberlin and some of the human characters who would interact with them. But he was always made sure that, unlike, say, Captain Kangaroo, where he lived in the treasure chest with the mansion and with all these characters, that no, this was a land we were going to visit for a half an hour every day. I think that to be able to stimulate children, to be able to teach them to dream, to appreciate the wonder of life, is so very important to do that. And, one of the problems we have today is that I think children are having hope stripped away from them. They don't have any good reason to believe that their worlds or their lives are going to be better than their parents' was. And that's something that would have been unthinkable until a few years ago, that things weren't going to continue to improve. And now I think that's a really hard sell for parents as well as for children. And you have a problem with children not being stimulated and not being able to imagine these things. And Fred Rogers understood that any kind of achievement, any kind of greatness comes from the mind, comes from the ability to be able to work to make the possible happen, and to be able to, to dream the things that other people dream, and to be able to turn those dreams into reality, or to just be able to think of them. That's one of the greatest gifts you can give to a child. And a healthy child in that sense grows up to be a healthy adult.
Inside or outside of television, do you think that there's anyone in the American public sphere that has the ethical or I guess, I don't know, ethical, the persuaded, the standing that Fred Rogers, is there a 21st century Fred Rogers currently?
No, I don't think so. When you were describing those things, what I was thinking of was the moral credibility. It would be the way that I would describe it too. We've seen all of our heroes brought down. We've seen all of our institutions become distrust, not just to have a less trust, but actively distrust. And I don't know who it would be. I don't think there is anybody that has that level of moral authority and trust and love and the way people feel about Rogers. I don't think there is anybody like that today.
I'm a writer, and one of the things that I remember the most about the Mr. Rogers show, especially over the years, I remember when the movie The Thin Red Line came out in the late 90s, there's a poetic narrator who's narrating from beyond the grave, we later find out, and there's several characters that narrated. And I remember that Mr. Rogers was capable of a very kind of prosaic but offhanded poetry. I remember one time he referred to differences not having to be walls but to be bridges, and something like in that kind. And so things like that, things like possibly an astronaut, the little boy in the wheelchair, they come to my mind as sort of quintessential Mr. Rogers moments. Yep. Finally, let me just ask you, uh, what is your one or two most, if not fond, most important memories of
Hmm.
that show and Rogers in it?
Well, I think I'm trying to think. When I grew up, when Fred Rogers was on TV, I was a little past the target age for that. I grew up watching Captain Kangaroo, and I was a bit past the target age for Rogers. I actually started watching him more when I was a teenager because of the dearth of anything else to watch on television. And so I got to know him more in that sense. And as an adult, and watching the documentaries about him and listening to him talk, but I think his show, you know, the a specific episode. I come back to that special about RFK because it's such an extraordinary thing to put on 2 days after he's assassinated, to be able to come back and understand that while everybody else is dealing with their grief, who's talking about what the children are going through. More broadly speaking, I think that it is just the immense humanity of the man. That's a word I use a lot. When we were doing the Quinn Martin show, I talked about the humanity of a character like Frank Cannon. And in other shows we've done and in other things I've written about, I've talked about how characters are able to demonstrate a humanity that goes beyond the standard is, to introduce an element of what the world really is all about. And I think that when we talk about Fred Rogers, that's the word that keeps coming back to me more than moral authority, more than respect, more than any of these others, is humanity. And when we take a look at the root word of humanity being human, what does it mean to be a human being? It means more than to just be alive. And I think that is what he encapsulated. It's not just living, it is infusing life with life, if you will, and bringing that humanity and sharing it with other people. And he was incomparable at that.
Well, another good couple of shows that we did about interesting people, and hopefully this series can keep growing with the decades, the focus on individuals, the
Hmm.
focus on maybe a show or an overall theme. Because I think I don't, as far as I know, I don't think there's any other series like this on YouTube. That has just two talking heads talking.
I don't
But
think so either. And I know we mentioned at least on the emails about doing one on when we're talking about people who should be better known. That Dave Garroway was one
mm,
of the ones, and I would be happy to send you Jody Peeler's contact information because
oh yeah.
as Dave Garroway's biographer, I can't think of anybody who knows that subject better. That whether you wanted to do it in the same way we did with Martin Grams when we were talking about the Twilight Zone
Mm.
as three, or if you just wanted to do a one-on-one with her, I'd be happy to share the information on her.
Oh yeah, no, we do it. We do it all together.
Okay.
Yeah, but send me that, and for
Mhm.
those who are watching, we'll see you in the next month or so with some more stuff on American television.
Absolutely looking forward to it. Thanks a lot, Dan.